Censorship is rampant, pervasive. It's becoming the norm rather than the exception. If you're not censored, people are asking, wow, what's wrong with you? What have you not said that didn't result in you being censored? I defended the rights of Nazis to march in a Jewish neighborhood in Skokie, Illinois, with Holocaust survivors. I can't imagine anything more obscene than neo-Nazis carrying signs about putting Jews in the gas chambers in a community of survivors. And yet I defended the rights of those Nazis to do that because I don't want to give the government the power to tell people what they can say and other people what they can hear. I defended the rights of anti-Israel to speak on the Harvard campus. I defended the rights of Palestinian students to put the Palestinian flag up when Yasser Arafat died. I am constantly defending the rights of people who I fundamentally disagree with because I elevate principle over partisanship. I am politically homeless because I'm nuanced and I'm balanced and I apply to myself the shoe on the other foot test. What would I be saying if the shoe were the other foot? What would I have said if Hillary Clinton had been elected president and she were being impeached? Let me tell you what I would have said. I would have opposed her impeachment. In fact, the original title for my book was The Case Against Impeaching Hillary Clinton. It then changed to The Case Against Impeaching Donald Trump when he got elected instead of she being elected. So censorship is pervasive and it's a very, very worrying trend.
The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs. Sharing our vulnerability. Overcoming our fears. Transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go?
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is... This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Alan Dershowitz, the American lawyer, academic, and author. You have spent your career defending high-profile clients like American football player O.J. Simpson, WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange, champion boxer Mike Tyson, Harvey Weinstein, and Jeffrey Epstein. This year, you represented President Trump in his Senate impeachment trial, which resulted in his acquittal. At the age of 28, you became the youngest full professor at Harvard Law School, and you have published more than 1,000 articles in publications like the New York Times Magazine, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal. Throughout the global coronavirus pandemic, you have been outspoken regarding online censorship, the erosion of civil liberties, and the legalities of mandatory vaccination. Alan, welcome to London Real.
Thank you so much for having me on.
It's great having you here. Before we get started, I just wanted to announce to everybody that we are streaming on our brand new Digital Freedom platform, which is a censorship-free, independent broadcasting system that is of the people, by the people, for the people, and available exclusively on our website at freedomplatform.tv. Can everybody watching us now please share this link via the sidebar on their social media channels? And Alan, I pledge to you and everyone watching us that none of this conversation will be edited, censored, removed, or banned, and that anyone in the world can watch the full version of this episode free at londonreal.tv/Dershowitz. Thanks to the generous donations of over 32,000 people around the world that I affectionately call the London Real Army. For anybody wanting to become a founding member of the Digital Freedom Platform, they can go to freedomplatform.tv/give to donate and fight with us on the front lines to protect our human rights. Here at London Real, we've been a platform for free speech since 2011. And Alan, I'm super excited to have you here today. Maybe we start by talking a little bit about censorship. You know, up until 9 weeks ago, I had never had any piece of content taken down, banned, or deleted. But in the last 8 weeks, a lot of my content that's been uploaded to these platforms has now been exactly that. And I've been deplatformed from many places, including LinkedIn. My TED Talk mysteriously disappeared. And I think it's because we've been talking about controversial issues like the coronavirus and vaccines and 5G. I'm curious what you see out there that goes on with these social media platforms. And does that constitute censorship in your mind?
Well, of course, it constitutes censorship. It may not constitute governmental censorship, which is the worst kind of censorship, but any kind of censorship is bad. We see the New York Times firing an op-ed editor because he allowed Senator Cotton to do an op-ed, which many of the readers disagree with. I've been censored. CNN has deplatformed me. It won't allow me on its air because I defended President Trump's constitutional rights. The 92nd Street Y, which is a liberal forum for speech, mostly about Jewish matters, wouldn't allow me to speak even about a book defending Israel. So censorship is rampant, pervasive. It's becoming the norm rather than the exception. If you're not censored, people are asking, wow, what's wrong with you? What have you not said that didn't result in you being censored? So censorship, particularly from the hard left and the center left. You know, I grew up with McCarthyism when the censorship came from the right, and I fought against that. I'm not a person of either the right or the left. In fact, my newest book is called The Case for Liberalism in an Age of Extremism, or Why I Left the Left but Couldn't Join the Right. I am politically homeless because I'm nuanced and I'm balanced, and I apply to myself the shoe on the other foot test. What would I be saying if the shoe were the other foot? What would I have said if Hillary Clinton had been elected president and she were being impeached? Let me tell you what I would have said. I would have opposed her impeachment. In fact, the original title for my book was The Case Against Impeaching Hillary Clinton. It then changed to The Case Against Impeaching Donald Trump when he got elected instead of she being elected. So censorship is pervasive, and it's a very, very worrying trend.
Yeah, it's dangerous, and it's great to see your perspective, Alan, because you've been through a few of these phases in the country and in the government as well. What do you think when you see these, trillion-dollar companies with these technology platforms that kind of hide behind a community policy? This is what I'm going up against with YouTube, where there's this community policy that seems to change on a whim, that seems to be very subjective, and that way they seem to be making subjective judgments about content. And it's quite frustrating, but they say, well, it's a private company and you have to opt into our platform, when other people are saying these things act like public utilities and maybe we should, regulate them as such.
It's the hardest question under the First Amendment and freedom of speech that I've ever encountered in my adult life of 60 years fighting these fights. On the one hand, you don't want the government to be regulating the content of private companies, even companies that are very, very powerful. On the other hand, we see today that these private companies have more influence on public opinion than any government agency known before to history. And so how to strike the appropriate balance between the two goals of freedom of speech. One is to prevent government censorship, and two is to open up the marketplace of ideas as widely as possible. And they used to be the same because it was the government that was the primary censor under McCarthyism and other institutions of the kind. Today, it's the private sector, the university that's becoming a source of censorship, the New York Times, obviously, the social media platforms. So we really have to think hard about how to strike the appropriate balance between keeping the government out of our free speech and, on the other hand, opening up the marketplace of ideas as broadly as possible.
Yeah, I had a guest on last week that says we have a fourth branch of the government, and is these Silicon Valley technology companies that in some ways are dictating to the government. When we saw President Trump come out against Twitter and saying, you're flagging me for producing quote unquote false information, we're seeing these companies more powerful and now regulating the government, or us here in the UK. It's coming out of some company in Silicon Valley.
Well, we're now seeing, for example, that there are attacks on Facebook, and advertisers are withdrawing from Facebook because they haven't censored President Trump.
Yeah.
And the failure to censor people who they disagree with, even if he's the president of the United States, a man I voted against. I was a Hillary Clinton supporter, but I believe in free speech more than partisan politics. But now Facebook is facing a pushback from advertisers because it won't follow the masses and the crowds. And what's happening today is you have to choose sides. You have to pick sides. Whose side are you on? If you're on the side of Trump, then fine. If you're on the side of the Democrats, then you can't say anything about Trump's constitutional rights. If you're on the side of Black Lives Matter, then you can't criticize them for having in their platform calling Israel a genocidal and apartheid country. I guess you have to pick sides. You can't have nuance. Nuance has no place in a revolution. And what we're seeing is an attempt by people on the hard left and the hard right to use these terrible killings and these legitimate protests as an opening wedge to a revolution in which the first thing revolutionaries do is shut down dissent, shut down opposing points of view, whether it be the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution. You know, interestingly enough, during the American Revolution, the press was not shut down. It was shortly thereafter, with the enactment of the Alien and Sedition Acts, that President John Adams tried to shut down the dissenting press. So every country has had a history of suppression and trying to abolish dissent and trying to present one point of view, which is the truth with a capital T. But there's no such thing in politics.
You're right. There is no nuance. You have to be you're either on our side or you're on the other side. And you're kind of given the choice. It's like when you go to a restaurant, do you want red or white wine? And maybe you don't want any wine. But in this case, you don't get to choose. Like you said, there's no nuance. And you're feeling that.
You even have rosé when you go to a restaurant. But in politics today, there is no rosé. You have to pick the red wine or the white wine. And if you pick the red wine, you can't even taste the white wine.
Alan, you're a lawyer. I'm curious what you think about this opinion, because we're kind of taking legal action in the US and the UK against some of these platforms. What do you think of the argument that some of these private companies act as public utilities and as such might need to respect the laws of the land? There's, I think, a precedent here in the UK where the London Stock Exchange as a private company was still looked at as a public utility. When I look at YouTube here, there's ads being run by the NHS. It's a communication tool, especially during lockdown. Do you think there is an argument there to regulate these entities as such?
Well, the argument doesn't flow from the fact that you can regulate private industry. You can regulate the airline industry. You can regulate trains. You can regulate a great many private industries because those industries are not protected by the First Amendment to our Constitution. But the First Amendment says Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. So the problem is that when you have people who are exercising the First Amendment, they're not like other regulable industries. So, as I said, this is the hardest, most complex issue of the relationship between law, philosophy. Remember, people think of freedom of speech as the marketplace of ideas, but that's just not true. And I think John Stuart Mill understood that even back 150 years ago. Just because you don't have censorship by the government doesn't mean you have an open marketplace of ideas. Non-government entities can close down the marketplace of ideas when CNN won't allow me on television to express views different. And when they doctor a tape, which they did of mine, I said in the Senate that a president could be impeached if he committed an illegal quid pro quo. They doctored the tape to have me say a president can't be impeached even if he commits an illegal quid pro quo, totally doctored it, and then wouldn't allow me on to correct the record. They scheduled to have me on, and then from on high, the word came down, we don't want Dershowitz correcting what we did by doctoring his tape, so I've been banned from CNN, a private company. That shut down the marketplace of ideas. When Netflix presented a one-sided, biased series presenting some of the women who Jeffrey Epstein had abused, they excluded the data and evidence that showed that several of these women, including the woman who accused Prince Andrew and accused me, had a long history of lying and had emails that showed that she never met me, never heard of me, that her own lawyer in a tape-recorded conversation said she couldn't have met me and that she was wrong, simply wrong. That was all kept off the air. That's a form of censorship. And fortunately, we still have available to us legal remedies. So I am suing Netflix. I am considering suing CNN. You know, I never sued anybody in my life. Almost 82 years old. I spent the first 70 whatever years of my life never suing or being sued. And now I'm going to end my life and career in court. I'm probably going to die arguing a case in front of a jury in favor of free speech, but it's a good way to go.
Yeah, I love this concept of the marketplace of ideas because, again, the reason I got into this fight is because we live streamed a conversation in this studio, and it was the second largest Ustream in the world on April 6th, second only to President Trump's coronavirus, daily update. And it would have gone on to be watched 30 or 35 million times, this conversation, one of the most watched in history. And yet it was banned and deleted 30 minutes later on YouTube. So no longer was there a marketplace where people could consume what this guy said. He's a 68-year-old man, does not incite violence, revolution, destruction of property. He's got some weird ideas, but there was clearly a demand for them. But now that he's off a platform like YouTube, now you can't have access to them. So now you have to find another way around, and you have to find our platform. And so I guess, like you said, that is censorship, isn't it? And it removes that option for people.
Of course it's censorship, and it's censorship that goes in one direction. If an institution has a single standard on which it will allow programs to be shown on its platform, that would be one thing. But clearly there is no single standard. It's very selective, and it's applied very differently to the right and to the left, and to different kinds of speech. And so what we have is the worst elements of censorship. It's not across the board censorship. It's selective based on content. And that's precisely what the concept of the marketplace of ideas is supposed to prevent. But it's not working in the United States today. It's not working well all over the world because the United States dominates social media. And what happens in the United States spreads all over the world. We complain when China, and appropriately so, limits access of its citizens to anti-Chinese information, but we should be complaining as well when social media imposes biased restrictions based on standardless criteria, and we're not complaining loudly enough because we're the victims. We're entitled to hear different points of view. I'm sure I would have disagreed fundamentally with the content of what was on your show, but that's my right to disagree, but I have to be able to hear it first before I disagree with it. Now, if you want to impose standards, I call it the circle of civility, exactly the same standards on all sides, well, we can have an argument, discussion about that. I'd probably be opposed to it because I'd rather hear everything, but at least you could say we're applying a single standard. Today, we have the worst elements of censorship, that is, the marketplace of ideas closed, and it's closed selectively.
We've never seen some of these monopolies like this before. I mean, we saw it in the past with railroads and gas and steel, but this is like a monopoly or an information monopoly where it pervades all aspects of our life and our digital identity and our regular identity. For a lot of people, especially young people, it's hard to know where one stops and the other ends. And sometimes you don't even know you're in an information war. You don't know that maybe your opinions are being formulated by someone else. It's a strange time right now.
And we thought that the digital age would end that. We thought that, when 20 years ago, 30 years ago, there were 7 or 8 TV channels, that was a monopoly. And today, when you can have thousands of platforms, it would end the kind of control that a handful of people had on information. But it's had exactly the opposite result. What we see is, even though there are many, many platforms, they are controlled by a few handfuls of major private social networks, and they control the flow of information. And I think, again, we are the victims, we, the public, that should be able to hear anything we want to hear and form our own opinions. In the end, it's a sense of distrust. They don't trust us to come to the right conclusions. That's what's going on university campuses today. I'm a moderate, centrist liberal, and I can't speak on a university campus today without being threatened with violence. Universities don't invite me mostly because they don't want the violence, so might as well invite somebody who's less controversial. And so the students actually don't hear conflicting points of view, and they don't want to hear conflicting points of view because they feel very comfortable hearing from their professors the truth as they want it to be heard without any nuance or without any conflicting views.
Do you ever wonder how we got here, Alan, from where the experience you had as an undergrad, at Yale or even at Harvard, how we got to this point? I mean, it must be such a different atmosphere than when you went to school and when I went to school. How did we get here?
Very different. Look, I grew up in the streets of Brooklyn. I didn't go to Yale or Harvard. I went to Brooklyn College, got into college in the skin of my teeth. I came from a poor family. We couldn't afford, fancy Ivy League schools. But where I went to school, there were debates all over the place. Everybody argued with everybody. The president of the university tried to ban communist speakers from speaking on campus, so they would speak on the street corners. And we would go and listen. I hated communism. I thought it was appalling. I hated Stalin. I hated, anything that had to do with communism or fascism. But I always went and tried to hear opposing point of view. There was a little bookstore in my neighborhood run by a Trotskyite. And my parents said, you can't go to that bookstore. It's a communist store. They'll probably take your picture and you'll have a permanent record. Of course, we all snuck into the store because we wanted to read what was banned. Anything that's banned, you want to read. Today, you can't get access to material that's banned. You can try to flip the channels, but you don't really find dissenting views as much as you did when I was growing up. In the early days of America, people like Thomas Paine would be able to stand on street corners and hand out for a penny or even free a one-page hand-printed leaflet. Today, that's not the way in which we get information. And so mind control is exercised not by the government as much as it is by private companies.
Have you ever thought if, say you were a younger man, say you were in your late 20s, and you got a presidential appointment to solve this problem? You got 20 years and whatever you want, whatever powers you want. Have you ever thought about how you might solve it? Is it solvable? Is it so complex?
It's very complex. It's very complex, and it requires striking a balance between not giving the government too much power and giving it too little power. It's so interesting. Even liberals and conservatives are very ambivalent about the power of government. Libertarians argue you should have less government power, less government control, but then some libertarians say, but when it comes to the social media, maybe the government should have more power to regulate the social media. There are very few principled people in the world, principled libertarians, who will allow their libertarianism even to hurt their political outcomes. The same thing is true of free speech. The most common approach to free speech is free speech for me, but not for thee. Due process for me, but not for thee. My God, if a woman accuses you of doing anything wrong sexually, why do you need due process? Of course, women always tell the truth, and men who deny what women are saying always lie. There must be a gene that's associated with gender and lying and telling the truth. Why do we need due process? Why do we need free speech? We know what the truth is. We know you did it. We know you're innocent. We know you're a bad president. We know you're a good president. We don't need debate. We don't need discourse. That's the world we're moving into. It's not 1984. It's not Brave New World, because even those great authors could not have anticipated the pervasiveness of the censorship that we're experiencing today.
And you're making reference to the Me Too movement a little bit there.
Yes. The Me Too movement is me, but not you. Me too, but not you. I mean, I'd like to start a movement of men who have been falsely accused. Me too. Yeah, I've been falsely accused by a woman I never met, and I have evidence to prove it. But you wouldn't know that by watching Netflix. You'll learn it when Netflix has to stand in court with their hand on a Bible and has to swear under oath and explain why they didn't present the truth to their viewers. But until that happens, people just believe what they see on Netflix and don't understand that what they're seeing is a censored version of the truth.
How frustrating is that for you, Alan, to sit down and do those interviews with Netflix, expecting them to give you, a non-biased version or a non-edited version, and then to see it come out and just be like, oh my gosh, this is the last thing I expected in my 80s to happen, and now I got to go sue you. What's that like?
Well, no, I mean, it is surprising because, the woman who came to me and made a contract with me, an oral contract in front of my wife and witnesses, saying that she would use this material, and then just broke her promise, lied through her teeth, and refused to put the material on the air because it affected their narrative. Their narrative is women tell the truth. And I had proof that at least two of the women had lied pervasively about, having sex with Ehud Barak and George Mitchell and Bill Richardson and you name it, and having sex tapes of Hillary Clinton. Just lie. But you wouldn't know that if you watched Netflix. And so they're going to have to bear the consequences of that in the courts of law.
And in the Me Too movement kind of set that up where, like you said, there's no due process.
Sure.
There's free speech for me, but not for you. So it kind of gives us the lens to look at these things and say, oh, it must be true because we're used to that always being true.
And it's mostly true. And the point, it's very persuasive when you get things that are mostly true. And I think most women who are victims of sexual abuse tell the truth about it. And most men who are accused are probably being truthfully accused, but most is not enough for due process. Better 10 guilty go free than one innocent be wrongly confined goes back to Blackstone and to the founders of the American Constitution. But on the Me Too movement, it's better 10 innocent people be falsely accused than even one guilty person be falsely acquitted. They've turned the doctrine on its head because it's a political movement. And beware of rabid political movements. Be skeptical, whether it be a Black Lives Matter, whether it be a Me Too, all these movements that do good. It was Eric Hoffa, the great philosopher, who once said, always every cause starts as a movement, then it becomes a business, and ultimately a racket. And now we're seeing the movement from business to racket. We're seeing Me Too being turned into a racket by abusive lawyers and women who are lying for money. I think we're seeing Black Lives Matter at the extremes. We'll see it soon turned into an extortion racket. You don't want your store burned down? Hey, there are ways of dealing with that. Pay me money. That has happened to every movement, every good movement, the union movement. Every good movement has moved from cause to business to racket. And our job is to prevent that, to keep it a movement, to keep it a cause, and to make sure it doesn't get hijacked for purposes that are not relevant to the core of the movement.
What's your read on the events in the U.S. in the last 2 weeks, from the protests to the riots to, the calls for the defunding of the police? You mentioned a couple things there, but what is your view overall?
My view overall, of course, is that defunding the police is a revolutionary act. It's designed to make sure that there is no way to control the violence of revolutionaries. It's a step toward revolution. And the first victims will be poor people, and particularly people of color who need the protection of the police. Those of us who have some wealth will hire private guards. We're not going to need the police. I don't generally need the police. But the people who need the police will be denied the protection. Are you going to now the next defund the fire department because there have been some racist people in the fire department? Are we going to defund the army because people in the army have sometimes shot innocent civilians? No, you increase the funding so that you get better training. You make sure that the police officers or anybody else who violates the rules are disciplined or fired. You need money to do that. Defunding is absurd on its face. And obviously the act of just people who want to turn us into a violent revolution. And we have to stop that. Those of us in the middle, those of us in the center who want to see a just society, a non-racist society, a non-violent society, have to increase the funding of police and other organizations that protect us. In my experience, the vast, vast majority of policemen, FBI agents are wonderful people who just want to go home to their families at night and be safe and help protect us from violent criminals. So we should not be on the side of the criminals. I have a job where I sometimes have to be on the side of the criminals. I'm appointed by courts in murder cases, in death penalty cases, to defend people, some of whom are guilty, some of whom are innocent. That's my job. But even when I do my job, I side generally with law enforcement. I side generally with those who are trying to keep us safe.
And what about the fact that we've seen the destruction of property? And in some ways, I don't know, it feels like they're being allowed to kind of vent their anger, or I don't know, politicians and police seem to be a little more hands-off in this. What do you see there? And does that link back to the Black Lives Matter movement? And it feels like people are, I don't know, using people's emotions or co-opting this for some other gain, this revolution you're talking about.
Well, I think there are some. There are most of the people who are involved in protests are there for legitimate reasons. There's been too much police violence against too many African American, particularly men, but sometimes women. And that has to stop. And we have the right to protest that. That's a core part of free speech. Destroying property is not protected by the Constitution. Throwing Molotov cocktails into a police car, as apparently two young lawyers did recently in New York, is not protected by the Constitution. And that has to be stopped by the police. So again, nuance. Yes, protect every legitimate demonstrator. I would even give them a little room if they want to, for example, walk over the Brooklyn Bridge and stop traffic for half an hour. Okay, that's an act of civil disobedience. It's probably technically illegal, but if I were a police commissioner or a mayor, I don't think I would intrude to try to stop that. But once they start attacking property, particularly when they select the property, for example, in Los Angeles, there were graffiti on the walls of synagogues, Free Palestine, F, and then you can fill it in the Jews or Israel, or attacking neighborhoods that are ethnic. Those things have to stop. Violence against individuals is the worst form of violence, but we also have to protect property.
Alan, there's a documentary on Netflix called LA 92, and I've been watching it recently, and it kind of talked about the LA riots that came after, the Rodney King verdict, and then they flashed back to the Watts riots in 65. And, I wondered, there's obviously a pattern here. Well, does this end? Does this continue? Do you think we'll see reforms? What do you see?
I see reforms. I hope there are reforms. I hope that police officers, particularly of the kind represented by the main defendant in the Minneapolis case, are better screened and not allowed access to force. Training has to abolish chokeholds and knees on necks and all of that. We need to begin to use far less lethal methods of arrest. By the way, we shouldn't even be arresting people for passing $20 counterfeit bills. We should be giving them a summons, taking their driver's license if they have it, telling them they have to appear in court, but there's no reason for $20 to have to handcuff somebody, hold them down on the ground, and put them in a police car. So I think lots of reforms are overdue, and we're going to see lots of changes in our society as a result of the coronavirus. We're going to start with the smallest things. I'll probably never shake another person's hand in my life. Handshaking, I think, is over. The elbow is coming in. No more hugging. I think Zoom conferences, less travel. We learn from experience. I wrote a book called Rights from Wrongs, a secular theory of the origins of rights, in which I argue, and I think persuasively, that most of our rights grow out of a recognition of wrongs that we've experienced over time. Freedom of speech grows out of the experience we've had with censorship. Racial equality grows out of the experience we had with slavery. Human rights law grow out of the genocide of the 1930s and 1940s. So I think we learn from experience. Experience is the basis. Oliver Wendell Holmes once said, the life of the law is not logic, it's experience. And I think we're learning a lot from the coronavirus. The first piece I wrote about it was believe science, but be skeptical of scientists. And we saw scientists made so many mistakes. In the beginning, they said masks don't work. In the beginning, they said coronavirus is not transmitted by aerosol or by air, only by touching. Now we're having debates about people who are non-symptomatic and how contagious they really are. As a person with a family, I resolve all doubts in favor of caution. But that we need to have the information, and we need to have information that we can trust. And we live in a society now where we can't trust. There are so few people out there we can trust. I remember when Walter Cronkite was the major deliverer of the news, and he looked you in the eye like your great, wonderful uncle. And when he said something, we believed him. We trusted him. I can't think of people today in our society who invoke that sense of trust. And I hope we can restore that someday.
Yeah, every piece of information seems to have an agenda, and you can't always read what the agenda is. So everything's kind of tainted. How do you rate the world and the various government entities and the three-letter organizations on the last 90 days of the pandemic and lockdown? What do you see, Alan?
Well, I think there's a tremendous variation. I think Dr. Fauci has done a very, very good job. He's been honest and honorable. Has he been perfect? No, of course not. And let me give you an example of a problem, a good problem. So in the beginning, they were telling us not to wear masks. Why? Because there was a shortage of masks for healthcare workers, but they weren't honest with us. They didn't say, don't buy masks, even though they will help you and protect you, because it's more important that people who are doctors and nurses have the masks. That would have actually affected me. I wouldn't have bought a mask. I would have made one, but not bought one that would keep it from somebody who was in the public health or in private health, in any kind of health care. But they didn't do that. Instead, in order to achieve a good result, not having people buy the masks for private use, they didn't tell us the truth. They said masks don't work. Now, my instinct, just as a human being, is of course masks work. They may not work perfectly, but they work better than no masks. And so I'm going to wear a mask. And I did. And yet they had a good reason for deceiving us. But I think once you deceive the citizens, you've lost their trust. And so I think it was a serious mistake to do that. So, we're living through very dangerous times of distrust, of picking sides, of denial of free speech, and it's very, very worrisome.
Talk to me about vaccines, because you've come out and just talked about the legality of potentially a government-mandated vaccine. What are your thoughts on the science? I know you've got a debate coming up with Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who's been on this show. I think that's going to be fascinating. I'm really looking forward to that. That typically nobody wants to debate the not anti-vaxxers, they hate that term, Alan, but the people that question the vaccine. So I'm glad you're doing that. What do you see from the legal sense of what a vaccine might mean for us, and can we be forced to take one? What are your thoughts?
Mm-hmm. I think there are three issues. Number one, constitutionally in the United States, can the government compel you to take a vaccine? That's a legal issue, a constitutional issue, and there's a fairly clear answer to that. The answer is yes. There's a Supreme Court decision based on the smallpox vaccine that said the government has the right. If they can draft you in the army and make you die for your country, they can make you take a vaccine. The vaccine is not to protect you, it's to protect others. There is no right to be a typhoid Mary. So constitutionally, the issue is settled. The next question is scientifically, what are the arguments for and against vaccines? And the third argument, which is the most important, is we must allow people, whether they call themselves anti-vaxxers or critics or skeptics, we must allow them to have their day in the court of public opinion. We cannot shut them down, which is why I am deliberately agreeing to debate Bobby Kennedy, with whom I know I will end up disagreeing, but I want his view heard. I want his people to hear my view, and I want my people to hear his view. And the idea of shutting down any view on this very important subject, is going to backfire, because unless people are allowed to hear all points of view, they're going to say, no, I'm not going to take a vaccine. If they hear all points of view, maybe the scientists can persuade them to voluntarily take the vaccine. But in the end, the government will have the power to do it if legislation is passed. Now, you got to get past legislation, too. Governor can't make you do it. A mayor can't make you do it. Dr. Fauci can't make you do it. Only a legitimate legislature can pass a law doing it. Now, some states don't compel ordinary vaccinations, but they say you can't send your kid to public school unless he or she is vaccinated. That's another way of compelling it. People who homeschool don't have to do it. Anybody who wants to stay out of the public surely should have the right not to be vaccinated if they're not going to offer anybody contagion. I put it this way once. You have a constitutional right to inhale a cigarette. That's your own lungs, but you have no constitutional right to exhale it into my face. And the right to swing your fist ends at the tip of my nose, and the right to infect me ends at the tip of my nose. So if they developed a vaccine to prevent cancer or heart disease, none of us would have to take it. That's a choice we all have, whether to live or die or to take risks for our own health. But if the vaccine is designed to give herd immunity and to protect others, then the constitutional issue becomes a much more compelling one for compulsion. But look, let's continue to debate these issues. I want never the debate to stop. I want the debate to go on. And I don't care about those who say, well, if you allow them to debate it, maybe people won't get vaccinated. That's the cost of free speech. People will make decisions you don't like. And that's what we have to endure if we want free speech.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. And I'm so happy that you're going to debate Bobby, because like you said, it's important that your people hear his point of view and his people hear your point of view. And Alan, I'm going to try to put the majority of this conversation on YouTube, but I'll tell you right now, because we're talking about vaccines, I will be censored. If I upload a piece of content to YouTube, I actually have to tick a box that says it's vaccine related, because that way they'll extra check it. And I'm in such a place with that platform right now that I've been told, quite frankly, that I am one video away from being completely deplatformed. And for me, that's 9 years, 8,000 videos, 250 million views. So I'm probably not going to. And so I'm being censored as we speak now, which means people won't hear your point of view, which means there's no debate. So that's being stopped by some pretty big forces out there. And it's worrying.
I can't imagine that YouTube would censor my point of view on vaccines, but since it's being promoted by you, maybe so. Look, we have another experience. There is a commentator who did a series of videos on Israel, and I was asked to do a 2-minute or 3-minute thing on the legal basis for Israel's right to exist. And it was a kind of dry, dull, kind of legalistic, I don't think I'm ever dull, but legalistic analysis of how Israel came into being through the Balfour Declaration, through the various treaties of the League of Nations, the United Nations, all of that. And in order to see that, you had to check off certain things and indicate you were not a child. In other words, my presentation on Israel was apparently restricted to adults. And I can't imagine why. I didn't say anything that a 15 or 16 or 17-year-old shouldn't want to watch about a controversial political issue involving Israel. And I spoke to somebody at YouTube about it, and there's a lawsuit now being raised by Dennis Prager, who ran the platform. And we haven't gotten a particularly satisfactory answer. We were told it was done by an algorithm. But algorithms can censor too. Algorithms are written by individuals and human beings. So I would like to see some critique of this approach. And I want my views on vaccines, which are nuanced and centrist, to be able to be heard by people who want to watch it, and they shouldn't be censored.
Yeah, and I appreciate you saying this, and it's great to hear someone talk about these things, and I think people will appreciate it. Again, you said something earlier, it's trusting the science, maybe not the scientists. From my conversations, although they're brief with Bobby so far, is that, I went to MIT down the road from where you were at Harvard, and the science of a vaccine is a beautiful thing. The application and practicality of what seems to go on in the industry and the lack of liability and some of the things, that's what worries me more. And when you say if it's a proven vaccine, then I'm wondering, where do the facts come? And if that information is somehow tainted by a pharmaceutical company's profit or by a government's need to be the first company to have the vaccine. And that's where I worry. And that's when I worry about that.
These are all legitimate questions that should be debated in public and shouldn't be censored. The government has no right to make the following statement. Look, we want everybody to take vaccines. That's right. That's good. Therefore, we're going to deny them information that might incline them not to take the vaccine. That is not a permissible government function, to deny you the information that will produce a result the government doesn't like. The government has to allow you to get all the information from whatever sources there are and have you make up your own mind. Then they can perhaps enforce it and force you to have the vaccine, and maybe it'll make their life more difficult. But that's what freedom of speech is all about. Remember, it starts with wars. The leading case, United States versus Schenck, involves the government didn't want people who were about to be drafted into the army or volunteer to serve in the First World War. The government didn't want them to know that there were some people who thought this was Wall Street's war, it was an unfair war, because it might affect whether they joined the army or not. And that was an impermissible form of censorship. Censorship won in that case, but Justices Oliver Wendell Holmes and others wrote.
To continue watching the rest of the episode for free,
visit our website londonreal.tv or click the link in the description below.